Hello and welcome to the second of 8 lectures in the series Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This series is produced by Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, in cooperation with Third Age Learning KW. These lectures were presented at Rim Park in Waterloo between January 9th and February 27th, 2020. This lecture, Martin Luther's Life and Career, a Scholar in Turbulent Times, is delivered by Reverend Dr. Robert Kelly, Professor Emeritus of Theology, History, and Ethics at Martin Luther University College.
In examining the life of Martin Luther, one almost immediately encounters the problem of the many legends that surround one of the early leaders of the Protestant Reformation and the man credited with founding the Lutheran Church. Those of us of a certain age who grew up in the Lutheran Church might remember Sunday school stories, children's books, and movies about Luther. As a child, I was exposed to all of these at various points in my young life. They all presented some version of the same story. Young Martin was born in poverty and grew up in a struggling miner's family with cruel and overbearing parents. Somehow, he did well at school, though in his poverty he had to sing for his supper, and made it into the University of Erfurt. One day, in the midst of a raging thunderstorm, he made a reckless vow to become a monk if St. Anne would but protect him. After that, he gave up his university studies and entered a monastery where he plagued himself with penance and self-inflicted suffering. These are all interesting stories and certainly captured the mind of this child. The problem is that very few of them are actually true. They are mostly legends that were either made up out of whole cloth after Luther's death or loosely based on stories that the older Luther himself told while drinking beer after dinner with students and friends. And we all know what a reliable record that can be. The reality is that Luther's childhood and upbringing were somewhat more boring. His was a typical up-and-coming middle-class town family of the latter part of the 15th century in central Germany. Luther's father, Hans's family, were prosperous peasant farmers from the village of Mora in Thuringia. Luther's mother, Marguerite's family, were middle-class civil servants and court officials from the town of Eisenach, also in Thuringia. Since Hans was not the eldest son, he could not inherit the family farm. So he set off to make his fortune in the mining industry in the county of Mansfeld, like Thuringia, a part of electoral Saxony. And that is how Hans and Marguerite's eldest son, Martin, came to be born in Eisleben on November the 10th, 1483. So if you go to Eisleben, this is the house where Luther was born. This is its modern appearance, of course. The original actually burned to the ground in 1689 and was rebuilt as a memorial to Luther. It was then remodeled and enhanced by the King of Prussia in 1817. It was most recently renovated and expanded in 2007 through 2009. Not long after Martin's birth, the Luther family moved to the nearby town of Mansfeld, where Hans became prosperous and a leading citizen who owned a smelter for turning the ore from the mines into metal. Hans was a member of the town council and even served as Bürgermeister, the mayor, for several terms. The family was firmly bürgerlich, or bourgeoisie. So the house on the left is the house that has been shown for many years as the home of Luther's parents. It even has a bit of a museum in it. The archaeological site on the right is where many scholars now believe is the site of the actual house, showing us how difficult it is to get data by which we can test the reliability of local traditions. As the child of a leading family, young Martin began his education at St. George's School, connected to the local parish church. Here, Luther learned the basics of Latin grammar to prepare him for further schooling, since all academic work was carried on in Latin. When he finished at St. George's, he was sent to the city of Magdeburg to attend a more senior, better school. And after a year there, he was sent to Eisenach, where he lived with relatives of his mother and attended one of the best secondary schools in Thuringia. This house in Eisenach is probably, and I say probably, we think it is, the home of the Cotta family, the relatives with whom Luther lived in its present appearance as a museum to Luther. The original house being the section to the left, the modern museum being to the right. In higher schools, such as the one that Luther attended in Eisenach, students became more proficient in Latin and began to prepare for their university studies. It was the custom at this particular school that the students would go through town singing for their supper. Not because they were poor, but because, well, that was what you did at this school. It was just one of the rules. None of the students actually needed the money for food, because in the 1400s, poor people simply did not go to school. Martin's family's plan for his life was that he would attend the University of Erfurt, earn a law degree, and become an official of a significant city or a counselor for a prominent member of the ruling nobility. In other words, contrary to the legends, Luther did not grow up poor. His parents were not much different from any late medieval parents, and his life plan was typical for his social class. In 1501, Luther entered the University of Erfurt. When young Luther arrived, he was not terribly impressed with the academic seriousness of his fellow students, which we see here rioting from this woodcut around the same time. In his first years at Erfurt, he completed studies to earn his Bachelor of Arts degree, his Master of Arts degree in 1505, about the usual length of time for the beginning of the 16th century. Luther's career path was then to be into the law faculty at Erfurt, but in July of 1505, he dropped his law studies and entered the monastery of the Augustinian hermits in Erfurt and undertook studies in theology. This is the back gate of the monastery where new applicants had to knock on the door to be admitted. The story that is normally told is that Luther was caught in a thunderstorm on his way back to Erfurt from Mansfeld. In his fear at being struck by lightning, he prayed to St. Anne, one of the patron saints of miners, who was highly honored in towns like Mansfeld and Eisleben that depended on mining. He vowed to become a monk if she would but save him from the lightning. Now, it is entirely possible that something like this happened, but there are some issues with the story. One is that there are several versions of it. In one, Luther is walking, and in another, he's riding a horse. In some version, he invokes another patron saint of the miners. And all come, at best, from the older Luther telling stories to students and friends over beer. So there's the chance they might be a tiny bit embellished. It's also true that Luther's father was furious with him for giving up law and entering a monastery, and so young Martin needed an ironclad reason why he had done so. In late medieval Germany, fathers were really not all that interested in the desires of the sons. The other issue with the story is that if Luther became a monk only because of a fearful vow in a storm, he likely would not have joined the strictest, most scholarly order of monks in Germany. There were many orders where one could live the good life while still being a monk. But the Augustinian hermits were not one of those. And the Erfurt house was part of what was called the observant wing of the order, those who kept more strictly to the observances. Almost all of the Augustinian hermits were academics, and they staffed many faculties of theology in Germany. They held to spiritual disciplines such as memorizing most of the Bible and were careful in observance. The Erfurt Augustinian monastery would likely not have accepted a young man who was becoming a monk just because of a thunderstorm. This is the church of the Augustinian monastery. Luther embarked on the study of theology and made his way in the order. In later life, he told colorful stories about his experiences, once again over beers with students and friends. It is hard to know how close to his actual experience the stories were. Certainly, the Augustinian hermits expected spiritual discipline and physical labor, and there is much evidence that Luther had an overactive conscience. At the same time, he rose up through the ranks in the order as he moved from bachelor's to master's and eventually to doctoral degree in theology. He served as the prior of the Erfurt monastery, the second in command, and district vicar for Thuringia and Saxony, overseeing 11 monasteries. He was also selected to represent the observant order of the wing in a dispute in Rome with the less observant wing. Luther did all of the required basics in theology and then began to specialize in biblical studies. He learned Hebrew, which was not taught in every university and was the center of controversy at the time. As he moved to the more advanced degrees, he also began to teach the basic courses to the beginning students. Luther's superior and confessor, Johann von Staupitz, was called by the Elector of Saxony to be the professor of biblical studies at the Elector's new university in Wittenberg, and Staupitz took Luther along as his assistant. For several years, Luther moved between Erfurt and Wittenberg, completing his doctoral degree while lecturing in various topics. This is a drawing of Wittenberg from the middle 1530s. If anything, it was probably a bit smaller than this when Luther first arrived, but as you can see, even by the mid-1530s, it's not a very big place. When Luther completed his doctoral degree in 1512, he became a full member of the faculty of the University of Wittenberg. He was resident in the Augustinian monastery at the eastern end of the town. If you look at the picture, it's probably the building that sticks up at the far end of the town there. It's very, very close to the gate of the city at that point. And it was in this place that Luther would spend the rest of his life. Staupitz had meanwhile been elected vicar general of the order, and his time was fully occupied by administrative duties, so he made Luther professor of sacred scripture at Wittenberg in his place. Luther's career as professor at Wittenberg began with a series of lectures on the Psalms in the summer of 1513, and these lasted probably until the fall of 1515. In 1515 and 1516, Luther lectured on the book of Romans, and in 1517 on Hebrews. This is the earliest likeness we have from Luther, probably from around 1518, 1519. It was during 1517 that Luther began the uproar which led to the Reformation. And to understand that debate, we need to go back into the Middle Ages a bit. The medieval church taught that there were 7 sacraments: baptism, confirmation, penance, the Mass, marriage, ordination, and extreme unction. The sacrament which most affected most laity was penance, that is, confessing your sins to the priest. The idea was that every sin had an equivalent satisfaction, either a punishment or a compensatory good action. The punishments and good actions could be varied, but should always be equivalent to the sin. Sinners should feel sorry for their sins and confess their sins to a priest, who would then assign works of satisfaction. The penitent would then perform the satisfaction, and the priest afterward would pronounce the absolution, the forgiveness. At least that was the theoretical ideal. Pragmatically, the priest would assign the satisfaction and pronounce a conditional absolution. That is, release from the penalty was conditioned upon completing the satisfaction. This then fit into the growing notion of purgatory, a place where Christians went after death to be purged, to complete the satisfactions not completed in life. Persons who had more than completed their satisfactions in life, who perhaps even had a surplus of punishments and good deeds over sins, that is, of merits, went directly to heaven. As time went on, the theory developed that these saints had deposited their surplus of merits in something called the heavenly treasury of merits. The church, and in specific the Pope, held the key to this treasury and could dispense the excess merits as necessary. After a period of evolution, the church began to teach that the Pope could issue a plenary indulgence, that is, an indulgence for all satisfactions, for a small donation to the church. The entrance of money was a turning point. From that point on, indulgences became a potent fundraising tool for the church. This is Albrecht von Braundenborg. In 1499, the Elector of Brandenburg, whose capital was Berlin, died. His older son Joachim inherited the rule of the duchy and the electoral title, elector being one of the 7 people who elected the Holy Roman Emperor. An occupation was needed for the younger son, Albrecht. As often happened with younger sons in the nobility, Albrecht entered the church. In 1513, he became Archbishop of Magdeburg, even though he was too young by canon law. Shortly thereafter, he became apostolic administrator of the Diocese of Halberstadt, even though that too violated canon law. Each of these violations required a dispensation from Rome, which cost money, in addition to the pallium fee, which was the normal fee for being consecrated as a bishop. Right around this time, the Archbishop of Mainz, the primate or senior bishop of all Germany, died. Mainz was a rich territory controlling tolls on 2 of Germany's major rivers, the Rhine and the Main. The Archbishop of Mainz was also one of the 7 electors. Unfortunately for the archdiocese, they were down on their finances since they had lost several archbishops in quick succession, and the coffers were depleted from paying successive pallium fees. They turned to Albrecht because of his family's financial resources and political power. This is Jakob Fugger on the right and his chief accountant on the left. Albrecht arranged a significant loan from Jakob Fugger of Augsburg, known as Jakob Fugger the Rich, Germany's wealthiest banker, to pay all the necessary fees. The loan repayment was that Pope Leo X and Archbishop Albrecht would jointly declare an indulgence. Half of the proceeds would go to the Fuggers to repay the loan, and half of the proceeds would go directly to Rome. Why am I showing you a building in modern Germany? Well, my friends, that is the Fugger Bank. So if you should go to Augsburg, you can go to the Fugger Bank ATM, withdraw some euros, and strike a blow for the Reformation, or whatever, right? A prominent and successful seller of indulgences, the Dominican monk Johann Tetzel, was engaged to head up the preaching of the indulgence. Tetzel had his own organization, which was experienced in the necessary techniques for maximizing indulgence sales. He even had a nice advertising jingle. When the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. He preached soul-wrenching sermons which emphasized the torments of the soul in purgatory, and then pointedly asked his listeners how they could dare leave their relatives in such torments, when for the sum of only 20 marks, they could release them on the spot. Here are the indulgence salespeople in action. It was this particular sale of indulgences which inspired Martin Luther to compose a set of theses to debate the theological validity of indulgences. He was certainly not the first to do so. Since the very beginning of the practice, there had been theologians who protested that it was not at all good Catholic theology and was certainly poor pastoral practice. Luther had two audiences in mind when he wrote his theses. One was Archbishop Albrecht himself. Luther prepared a copy of his treatise, 95 Theses Against Indulgences, which he sent to Albrecht, dated October the 31st, 1517. Then he may or he may not have posted a copy of the theses on the so-called church door of the Church of All Saints, the Castle Church in Wittenberg, which you see here in its appearance at that time. Scholars debate whether the theses were ever actually posted. It would have made some sense. In addition to being the chapel of the local castle, the church also served as the chapel for the university, and daily services for students and faculty were held there. The outer wooden gate to the side entrance, which you can see in the middle of the bottom of the picture, was used by the students as a common place to post notices for the university community. So it might well have made some sense to post 95 theses against indulgences on the university bulletin board. But we will never know whether the theses were ever actually posted or not. One more place where we have to distinguish between legend and history. We do know, though, why Luther produced precisely 95 theses. And should you ever read them, some of them seem to repeat each other, amazingly enough. So why 95? Well, it turns out Albrecht had accompanied the declaration of the indulgence with a document which highlighted 94 reasons why one ought to buy indulgences. These theses led to a significant controversy over the question of indulgences. Printers across the German-speaking territories printed copies in Latin, their original language, and in a German translation which appeared rather quickly. Between October the 31st and Christmas, almost any literate person from the northeast corner of Germany to the southwest corner of Switzerland could have read the 95 Theses. It is doubtful that the document itself could have sparked a reformation or revolution or much of anything except an academic conversation. Somehow they connected to a store of unrest and dissatisfaction that had been growing for more than a century. This is Pope Leo X. At least two factors contributed to the dissatisfaction. One was that for a century, the papacy and the curia, that is, the council who advised the pope and headed up major arms of the church, had been dominated by the Italian aristocracy, particularly the Medici family and the Borgia family. Much of Europe was sick of the high living and lavish spending in Rome. In addition, Pope Leo X would never have been mistaken for a theologian or an ethicist. He was a Borgia, interested in enhancing the wealth and power of his family and in securing his own comfort. He dismissed the growing conflict in Germany as an argument among silly monks who would eventually tire of it all. Only a few members of the Curia took it seriously, and their voices were drowned out. This is Charles von Habsburg. Another factor that led to Rome not taking the Reformation very seriously was the death of Maximilian von Habsburg, Charles's grandfather and the Holy Roman Emperor. That meant that a new emperor would have to be elected by the 7 electors. The leading candidate was Charles, who was already ruler of the Low Countries and the King of Spain. Above all, the papacy did not want Charles to be emperor, because the Holy Roman Empire controlled territory to the north of the Papal States in Italy, and Spain controlled the territory to the south of the Papal States in Italy. Leo did not want to be surrounded by Charles's territories, since he preferred to get the major European princes fighting among themselves so that he could take advantage of the situation. One of the few electors whose position was unknown in the imperial election was Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. And so, in order to encourage his vote not to go to Charles, the Curia decided not to attack a prominent professor from Frederick's University in Wittenberg. At one point, they even offered to make Luther a cardinal. But the controversy over indulgences did not go away. Instead, it spread, first becoming a controversy not only about indulgences, but about the whole penitential system. Then it evolved to include controversy about authority, including the authority of the Pope. In a debate between Johann Eck of the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria and Luther, this controversy over papal authority came to the fore. With the help of considerable loans from the Fuggers again, which were used to bribe various electors, Charles was elected Holy Roman Emperor in spite of the Pope's best efforts. Charles V stood astride Europe, and there was little the Pope could do. What the Curia decided was that at that point they could move against Luther and try to stop the movement toward reform in the church. But Frederick the Wise, for reasons we still do not know, decided to protect Luther and not try to stop him. This led the Curia to begin to move toward declaring Luther a heretic, pushed by Johannes Eck. In 1520, Luther published several of his most significant essays. Luther had been a more or less orthodox Augustinian theologian when he started teaching in 1513. But by 1519, he was becoming more and more convinced of what came to be called the doctrine of justification by grace alone, through faith alone, which was the core of everything for Luther. One of the controversies of Luther's biography is the question of when he had his conversion from merits to grace. Later in life, he connected this change to new insights about the interpretation of Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, which would place the change to about 1515 when he was teaching on that passage. The problem is that his lectures on Romans, from which we have the complete notes, show no literary evidence of a significant change in understanding at that point. We really have no evidence from Luther's writings at the time that there was some one point of conversion. We can say several things from the literary evidence. One is that the basis of Luther's development already existed among several Augustinian theologians of the 14th and 15th centuries. Another is that between 1512 and 1519, Luther developed this basis provided him, which he had learned, in an increasingly radical direction. By 1520, his thought had become what we now think of as Luther's mature thought. Whether there was some one moment of conversion in that time span, we really cannot say. 3 publications from 1520 were particularly significant for increasing the influence of Luther's reform and for defining the nature of the movement. The first of these was entitled Address to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, published in August of 1520. In this essay, Luther maintained that there were sharp limits on the authority of pope and bishops, and that any layperson could take a hand in reforming the church if the ecclesiastical authorities neglected or refused to undertake necessary reforms. This was followed by a call to the secular nobility as the leading lay people and as lay people who exercised authority to take the lead in reforming the church. In October, Luther published an essay entitled On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which attacked the sacramental system, which was at the very core of the practice of the medieval church and the center of piety for every Christian in Europe. The work was quite polemical in tone, even suggesting that the Pope might be the Antichrist. Luther attacked the withholding of the cup from the laity and whether key rituals were even sacraments at all. The work was published in Latin, but was quickly translated into German, and this is the title page of the German edition. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to anyone in Wittenberg, in June, Johann Eck's campaign to have Luther declared a heretic bore fruit. Pope Leo issued the bull or declaration entitled Exsurge Domine, after its first words in Latin, Rise up, O Lord. The bull condemned 41 specific statements of Luther as heresy and threatened excommunication to anyone who spread these ideas. Luther and his supporters were given 60 days to recant and cease teaching the heretical ideas. Eck and one of the cardinals were given the task of publishing the bull in Germany, including Saxony. Almost everywhere they went, they met with opposition, so the process was slow. A copy of the bull was probably delivered to Luther about the same time that the Babylonian captivity came off of the presses. Unaware of the action in Rome, meanwhile, Luther's colleagues had been suggesting that he write something perhaps a bit less polemical to send to the Pope as a peace offering. Luther's response was the treatise on the freedom of a Christian, published in November. The freedom of a Christian is certainly less polemical than Appeal to the Christian Nobility or Babylonian Captivity, but to call it irenic would be a real stretch. It is addressed to the Pope with the subterfuge that he must be being misled by the horrible, poor theologians advising him. Luther will help out by teaching the Pope the truth. The treatise sets out Luther's fundamental understanding of the theology of salvation and his view of the life which Christians live in the world. 1520 saw a number of sermons and essays published by Luther, but these 3 are generally regarded as the most significant for the course of the Reformation and set the program for all that followed. In December of 1520, the 60 days granted by Exsurge Domine ran out. The faculty and students of Wittenberg recognized the day by gathering outside the easterly gate of the town, starting a bonfire, and burning the bull, along with books of canon law, collections of papal proclamation, and various works of medieval theology. This was Luther's response to the call for him to recant. The result was that Luther was excommunicated in January of 1521. Luther's excommunication did not dampen Elector Frederick's support for Luther, but it did increase pressure on him from other authorities, particularly Emperor Charles V. The Imperial Diet, which is more or less equivalent to the Parliament of the Holy Roman Empire and included representatives of all the princes, the bishops, and the free imperial cities, which were known as the estates of the empire, had opened in session in the city of Worms in January, shortly after Luther's excommunication. Charles intended to deal with Luther and the rising movement in order to root out heresy once and for all. Luther was summoned to appear before the Diet, but Frederick would only agree to his appearance after the emperor had guaranteed safe conduct. The imperial herald was sent to Wittenberg to accompany Luther back to Worms. Luther arrived in Worms on the 16th of April and was summoned before the estates, meeting at the palace of the Bishop of Worms the next day. 25 books and pamphlets were laid out, and Luther was asked whether they were his and whether he was ready to renounce the heresies in them. The first question was important because there were no copyright laws in the 16th century, and printers were free to print whatever came into their hands that they thought would sell. Books by Luther sold very well, but he only produced so many of them, so a number of forgeries appeared, as well as altered versions of his actual writings. Luther asked for time to ponder his answer and was given until the next day. When Luther appeared on the 18th, we only have clues to what he said from notes taken by people attending the Diet, which were published in various forms afterward. As near as can be determined from these sources, Luther's reply was that the books were his, but that he could not recant the substance of the books unless someone could prove from Scripture and clear reason that he was wrong. Until that happened, he would stand by them. The palace of the Bishop of Worms, where the Diet met, was destroyed by the French in 1689 and 1794. Today, there is a park where the palace once stood, and in the garden is this brass sculpture of shoes. According to legend, this marks the exact spot where Luther stood when he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other, God help me, amen." Did Luther actually say, "Here I stand"? Did he stand in this exact spot? Probably not. No one present at the Diet ever reported these words, and who knows where Luther was standing. But if you go to Worms, you can stand in the shoes and make a heroic proclamation, should you care to do that sort of thing. And Worms is a beautiful city, and they make some very fine wine in the region, so the trip will not be wasted. Luther left Worms almost immediately after his appearance. He had been granted safe passage, but Frederick was taking no chances. Along the road near Eisenach, Luther's agents staged a kidnapping of Luther and took him for safekeeping in the Wartburg Castle. The picture here is nothing like what actually happened, but I'm showing it to you because it is a mural from the town square in the village of Mora, the village where Luther's father was born and raised. It's an interesting piece of folk art in the genre of son of local boy makes good. This is the actual Wartburg. Not long after Luther appeared before the Diet, Charles passed and issued the Edict of Worms. Luther was declared a heretic and an outlaw, and reading or owning his books was forbidden. Luther was to be arrested by anyone who could and held for the emperor. Anyone who spread his teachings could be executed. Fortunately for Luther, by this time safe in the Wartburg, politics very quickly made it difficult for Charles to enforce the edict outside of his own hereditary territories. Francis I, King of France, declared war against Charles. So Charles needed troops provided by the estates of the empire to fight France, thus preventing him from enforcing the edict against those estates that supported Luther. Luther remained at the Wartburg, very loosely disguised as Junker Jörg, Knight George, from April of 1521 till the following March. Luther was never one to enjoy being cooped up away from the action, but he put his time to good use, translating the New Testament into German and writing a number of essays and pamphlets. While Luther was at the Wartburg, his colleague Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt, you got to love that name, don't you, became the leader in Wittenberg. Karlstadt had already begun to think that a less cautious approach to reforming the practice of the church should be followed. On Christmas Day in 1521, Karlstadt first celebrated the Mass with his proposed changes. These included ending the requirement of confession before receiving communion, changes to the text, changes to the way the presider dressed and spoke the words of the service. Perhaps the most controversial change was giving the cup to the laity. In January, Karlstadt convinced the city council of Wittenberg to begin removing artworks from the church, especially sculptures. On January the 19th, Karlstadt married, breaking a rule that had been put in place in the 12th century requiring clerical celibacy. The very next day, the imperial authorities, supported by the hierarchy of the church, ordered Frederick to undo these changes. One of the interesting things about Frederick is that while he supported the reform of the church and the writings of the Wittenberg faculty, we really do not know whether or not Frederick in his heart ever became what might be called a Lutheran, because he never revealed what his personal religious beliefs were, though he did receive communion from reformers on his deathbed. We do know that at this point he both stated his compassion for Karlstadt and ordered all of the changes reversed, with the exception, of course, of Karlstadt's marriage, which could not be undone. Around this time, Karlstadt also began to develop ideas different from Luther's, including the idea that Christ's presence in the bread and the wine of the Eucharist is not literally real, but is more symbolic. All this made another faculty member, Philip Melanchthon, very concerned. Melanchthon was always cautious, always wanted to seek compromise with the opponents, and was worried that becoming too radical would cause Frederick to withdraw support from the cause of reform. He wrote to Luther begging him to return to Wittenberg and take the situation in hand. Luther, who in spite of taking actions and writing books that upset all of Europe, was in himself really a very conservative late medieval person. In later centuries, people referred to Luther as the first modern person, but this is not really an accurate characterization. He grew up as a member of the late medieval middle class. He became a late medieval monk and academic, and he maintained a late medieval mind and habits until the end of his life. His first reaction to any change, especially a change he had not thought of, was almost always conservative. And so in March of 1522, he returned to Wittenberg to slow things down. Karlstadt was pushed to the side and eventually exiled from Saxony. He went to Switzerland, where he became preacher and professor in Basel. He died there of the plague in 1541. One of Luther's more unfortunate habits was that once he had a negative encounter and conflict with someone, he tended to see all subsequent people whose views were at all similar as being the same as his original opponent. Thus, when he encountered Zwingli and other Swiss and South German reformers, he assumed that they were all just Karlstadt in other guises. He tended not to see the nuances in the various theologians and simply dismissed them all as Karlstadtian sacramentarians. That was to have implications for any hope for Protestant unity when the threats from the emperor became more immediate. The year 1525 was most significant for Luther personally and for the course of the Reformation. Three things happened that year whose significance cannot be overemphasized. One of these events had been brewing for at least a century. That is the Peasants Revolt of 1524 to 1525. Peasant farmers had been revolting and protesting in various parts of the empire for at least a century, depending on local conditions. Particularly in southwestern Germany, the major nobility had been trying to consolidate power by pressing against the minor nobility and the local knights. These, in turn, had been requiring more from the peasant farmers in their various jurisdictions. Part of this was the effort to replace medieval traditional laws, often maintained by oral tradition, with Roman law in written codes. These demands often violated traditions that had been in place for many centuries by requiring increased tithes and dues, refusing traditional benefits and services, and changing land title and inheritance. The peasants protested and even revolted against these violations. The War of 1524 began with a local conflict in the town of Stühlingen along the border with Switzerland between Lake Constance and Basel during the harvest of 1524. Oops, I can't take that off. That's where the mic is. Okay, forget that. Unrest was so high in the southwest that the revolt spread quickly along the Rhine, into the Black Forest, into Bavaria, into Switzerland. By the end of winter, the revolt had become too big to put down with available troops, since most German troops were in Italy fighting with Charles V against the French. Peasants around the city of Memmingen in southwestern Germany issued a document entitled the 12 Articles in March of 1525 to summarize their grievances and propose solutions. And this pamphlet circulated throughout Germany. Luther's involvement with what became the Peasants' War began several years before in an encounter with a young clergyman named Thomas Müntzer. Müntzer had come to Wittenberg in 1517 and showed intense interest in the Reform movement. Luther even recommended him for a position in the town of Zwickau. What Luther did not know was that Müntzer had done extensive reading in medieval apocalyptic mysticism and was influenced by the ideas of Joachim of Fiore, a Cistercian monk and abbot from the end of the 12th century, who had published extensive ideas on the end of the present time. In particular, he predicted a coming age of the Spirit in which church and state would be superseded by the direct rule of the Holy Spirit through the ultimate order of contemplative monks. In the following century, some anticipated that this new age would have to be brought in through apocalyptic war in which God's elect would fight to defeat the forces of evil. To what extent Müntzer held to all of these views, we cannot be sure, but he certainly began to speak of a coming apocalyptic conflict, and he wrote of himself as surpassing Joachim. At first he thought Luther might be the one to lead, but he soon became disappointed. By April of 1523, he was the parish pastor of the village of Allstedt, where there is a castle of the Elector of Saxony. Müntzer's preaching was very popular, drawing people from all over the neighboring countryside. He compiled and published the first complete order of the Mass in German, which enhanced his popularity. Because he had been involved in unrest in Zwickau and Prague in 1520 and 1521, the Elector sent his brother John to hear Müntzer preach. Duke John had Müntzer preach at the Castle Chapel, where he delivered a fiery sermon on a passage in Daniel, calling on the Saxon nobility to lead a radical reform of church and society that would root out corruption everywhere, using whatever means necessary. They should not follow the advice of those soft-living scribes of Wittenberg and their constant counsel of caution. As you might imagine, Luther reacted quite badly to Müntzer's sermons, publications, and personal conversations. He wrote several treatises against Müntzer's apocalyptic radicalism. After the Allstedt sermon, he issued a scathing critique of Müntzer and called on the authorities to protect the people from such dangerous ideas. Duke John and Elector Frederick were also quite alarmed by what John had heard. They called the civic leaders of Allstedt and Müntzer for a hearing and informed them that such radicalism must stop. So in August of 1524, Müntzer left Allstedt for the free imperial city of Mühlhausen, not far away, where he called on peasants and townspeople to rise up and bring about the new age. The 12 Articles again. Meanwhile, of course, the Peasants Revolt, which had really become a war, was spreading, particularly into Thuringia. The peasants assumed that Luther would support their appeals, and he was sent a copy of the 12 Articles and asked for his response. In that response, Luther showed his extreme political naivete. He supported some of the demands of the peasants and cautioned the nobility that they were abusing the traditions. He also told the peasants that they misunderstood his concept of Christian freedom, which in his mind was spiritual, not political or social. He demanded that the peasants refrain from violence and obey the proper authorities. It was too late for that. Armies of peasants were burning convents and monasteries and attacking bishops' palaces. In addition, they had captured weapons and ammunition. A massacre by peasant armies at Weinsberg and the Odenwald hardened opinion against them. Luther became enraged and wrote a ferocious attack on the peasants, condemning them for the violence and calling on the authorities to use whatever violence was necessary against them. The reality was that the peasants were already doomed. On the 24th of February, the imperial troops thoroughly defeated the French and captured King Francis at a battle in Italy. With the war in Italy over, German troops began to return home in the spring. Peasants were slaughtered by professional troops in southern Germany along the Danube. In one battle, 2,000 peasants were wounded, 500 killed in battle, and 400 drowned in the Danube River. The Thuringian Revolt ended at the Battle of Frankenhausen on the 14th and 15th of May, when the combined armies of Prince Philip of Hesse and Duke George of Albertine Saxony defeated a peasant army, killing probably more than 3,000. A few days later, Thomas Müntzer was captured and executed. This battle ended the Peasants' War in Saxony, but the war continued in the southwest with more and more slaughter. By September, the peasants had been crushed everywhere. In light of the severe violence which the armies used against the peasants, Luther's second treatise looked horrible. It had come off the press even as the troops were killing. Luther wrote a third tract justifying his previous writings, but that only made matters worse. Obviously, the troops had cared little for what Luther thought, but many people saw his interventions as callous and cruel. One result was that the Lutheran Reformation never gathered much support in rural areas after 1525. Many townspeople supported the movement, but the peasants either remained Catholic or chose more radical options for reform. The Anabaptists and other radical reform movements saw their greatest strength in areas where peasant grievances had been strongest. As it happened with Karlstadt, Luther saw all radicals as if they were Munzer redivivus, even though Müntzer was not really all that significant to the peasant movement, nor did very many of the subsequent radical reformers actually agree with much that Müntzer had preached or written. Luther simply could not distinguish pacifists from apocalyptic radicals, or biblical literalists from spiritual mystics. He could not see difference, and he attacked them all as if they were identical followers of Müntzer. It was a mistake that plagued the Lutheran movement until our own age.
You've been listening to Martin Luther's Life and Career, A Scholar in Turbulent Times, the second talk in an 8-lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This series was presented at Rim Park in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, through January and February 2020 by Martin Luther University College and Third Age Learning KW. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like more information about Martin Luther University College and its programs, visit the school's website at luther.wlu.ca. And for more information on Third Age Learning KW and its upcoming lectures, visit the website at tal-kw.ca.